سيدي الله سيدي يا ابن سيدي ايوه سيدي يا ابن سيدي ايوه سيدي هرم الغيث ايوه عاذرنا سيدي ايوه عالي غليل ايوه سيدي هرم الغيث ايوه عاذر غليلي ايوه غليل الغالي ايوه عالتي ايوه عاذر غليلي ايوه عاذر نسيري ايوه غليل الغالي.
In the heart of Africa, torrential rains in the mountains of Uganda, rains whose path twists like a snake as it searches for a way from the watershed to the sea. From the peaks of Ethiopia, another flood spates down into the flat plain of the Sudan. Blue Nile and White Nile meet, surge on to the north, through the desert wastes, down the river valley of Egypt, the country with no rain, to the sea, 4,000 miles from its source.
To us in the Sudan, the source of the flood had ever been a mystery. We had heard that once each year it crept over the valley of Egypt, first filling the low places, then the whole valley. When the flood withdraws, the soil will be bountiful. But in the Sudan, the Nile seldom overflowed its banks, and only its path across the plains was fringed with green. In summer, it dropped far below the level of the plain. But long ago, men had learned how to raise its water. They labored in the heat of summer, not as slaves, but as men creating the means of life by their own energies. In time, they invented the sagya. The sagya was turned by oxen, and the water was lifted out of the river, lifted maybe a second time, until it could flow upon the plain even when the river was low. With such devices, the people living beside the river created gardens, but these small streams could make fertile only a narrow ribbon of green on either side of the Nile. And the great river flowed on to Egypt and did not help the far greater number of my people living on the dry plains of the Sudan. Come with me across these plains, away from the river, to Remetab, the village where I was born 65 years ago, in this my father's house. Once each year, my father, like all his ancestors since the world was young, waited anxiously for the rains, the one benevolent act of nature which made life on the plains possible. After each fall of rain, the land was busy with people sowing the one crop of dura, millet, which could be taken from it in each year. Our life depended on each grain of seed being multiplied 100-fold by the miracle of growth. And it was so if the rains were sufficient. But if they passed us by, What could we do? Could man control the rains, the sandstorm, or the Nile in flood? And so sometimes it would happen that even as he cut the heads of his durra, my father knew that it would not provide sufficient bread for him and his family until the next harvest was ripe, a whole year away. I, his eldest son Hassan, grew up in the knowledge that 1 year in 7 would be a year of famine. Now the earth had exhausted itself in giving us our bread. It was cracked, dead. We poured the grain into storage pits, covered it with earth already powdered with the heat of early summer. Then from 100 meters in the earth, we drew up water. The plains were dry, our herds were thirsty, and from one sunrise on to the next, for 3 months or more, life became just a matter of drawing water at the well. As we labored, we dreamed that the Nile might flow upon the plain. But it was only a dream. And soon the grazing round the village was exhausted, and we packed our tents and all our worldly belongings and set out in search of better grazing within reach of watering places along the Nile. We had set out in this manner every year since Adam was driven out of the Garden of Eden to wander in the wilderness. There was endless land, and though no crops would grow upon it for drought, our goats could find a living there. Without them, we could not have lived. My mother, Amira, spun their wool into thread. From this, she could weave our tents, our clothing, and our blankets. And we idled away the days, 6 long months, while the goats grazed even upon the bark of the thorn bushes and upon their roots. On goat's milk, we lived throughout the dry summer. On sour milk and unleavened bread from our durra. Such was the pattern of each year, each lifetime. When I was 20 years old, they anointed my head with sandalwood and sweet-smelling oils, and I was married. Then I took earth and water from the well and built a home. And I begot a son. And I called him Said, which means happiness. There was a daughter and a second son. and the dead weariness of our life soon descended upon them too. Then one day, when the men of the village were out with their herds, something happened which Said was never to forget. What was this thing that moved, yet without legs? From inside came people, one of them white-skinned and wearing strange garments. When our sheikh dared to approach, he spoke our language. But where had he come from? Why was he here? They set up strange implements and made signs one to another. Then they planted something in the ground. It was a stone. Then, after they had made a dance round it, they went away. The sound faded. We were alone again. But for the stone at the edge of the village, we might have thought that this visitation had been a mirage. Yet we had heard the sound which was to change our lives.
Nearer the river, not one engine, many engines were throbbing. In 1922, the governor of Blue Nile province started yet bigger ones. Engines to pump water up from the river onto the Gazira plain. Great engines, Nile conquerors, doing the work of thousands of ox-drawn sagiars. This was only a pilot scheme, part of a 10-year experiment to find a crop whose export would finance the whole country's development. Cotton was that crop. This wasn't a plan on paper. Here was the evidence. Now the administration, with the backing of the City of London and of Britain's cotton industry, hoped to dam the Nile at Sanaa and irrigate 2 million acres on the Gazira. This scheme was but part of a still greater plan to control the whole length of the Nile. The idea of Nile control was started in 1837 when Muhammad Ali planned, by damming the Nile, to raise the low summer water onto a part of the delta. When repaired and strengthened in 1887 by British engineers, it was capable of raising the summer water onto almost the whole of the delta, giving Egypt a second crop to feed her rising population. The next step was more weirs, to double the harvest of Upper Egypt. Then in 1902, one of the world's most remarkable achievements, the Aswan Reservoir, 160 miles long, to store 5 million tons of floodwater for use in the dry season. When more storage was needed, Egypt looked beyond her frontiers into the Sudan. Her hope to store water here near the junction of the Blue and White Niles clashed with the Sudan's intention to bring water to the Gazira plain from a dam and reservoir at Sanaa. This clash over the ownership of Nile waters was solved wisely by negotiation. Egypt might build her own reservoir in Sudanese territory at Jebel Aulia and could have a half interest in the storage at Sanaa. When Sanaa was being built in 1924, the pump stations raised water onto some thousands of acres later to be incorporated into the Gazira cotton scheme. And thus it was that Hassan and his son saw green things growing ahead of them on land that had always been wilderness. In the heat of summer, when their world should have been dried up, there was grazing for his hungry animals.
What is happening? Has the Nile changed its course? What are those green leaves that grow instead of dried thorns? plant that was growing was cotton. Someone had stolen our land for cotton. And I was angry and afraid, for in my heart I knew that here was something stronger than me and all my people. And therefore, when another white man visited us, poured water down a trench and told us to imagine it was the Blue Nile, I was not willing to believe his words. He took a head of Adura, stuck it in the ground to mark the position of Remetab, 30 miles away from the river. I wondered what false promises he would make. But he showed us a head of Dura of a size that had never been seen before. We would all have such Dura, he said, if the Nile came to Remetab. And there would be lubia for our herds, and cotton. Perhaps it wasn't just a plan to steal more of our lands. Then he told us how the profits from the sale of the cotton would go as to 4 parts to the government for supplying us with water, to the company which would provide the money and organize the work, 2 parts, and to the tenant farmers, that is, to each of us, 4 parts for our labor. The Dura and Lubia would be our own. All these things will be brought about, he said, when the government dams the Nile at Sennar. Watch, he said, how the river would rise and flow across the plains, even to Remetab.
We built Sennar 2 miles long, with 80 sluice gates to pass the flood without obstruction. When gauges upstream report that the flood is slackening, the sluices are lowered and the tail of the flood is trapped in the reservoir stretching 80 miles upstream. For half the year, the engineers pass the water 2,000 miles down the Nile to Egypt. From August to January, it belongs to the Sudan and is drawn off into the canal on the far side of the river. The sluices at the head of the canal were first raised in 1925. A new pattern grew, and famine and drought were banished from 2 million acres of wilderness.
Our dream that the Nile would flow upon the plain had become true. Never again would there be drought. Yet, though we had become partners in what they said was the largest farm in the world, we were still simple people. We might plant cotton instead of Dura with our digging sticks, but everything else in those first years of the scheme was a mystery to us. Fertilizers, mechanical plows, what could we know about them? Yet work had to go on even while we learned. The company's block inspectors became our instructors. They drilled the routine of our new life into us with strict discipline. Crops must be rotated, I was told. Today we know that rotation is necessary, but at that time, how could I understand? And I was angry. Since then, many things which once would have been miracles have become just a part of our everyday life, of my life. My cotton is sprayed, as you will know, to protect it from disease. Look at my irrigated Dura, so tall, yet when I was a child, I had to bend low to cut it. And there is the lubia for my herd. All this on land that was wilderness. Come again, over the now fertile plain into Remetab, The surveyor's stone is still there. We still keep goats, but never again will we wander with them in the wilderness. Look, if we are sick, there's the health visitor come to tend us today and every day. At the co-op, we can buy tea, coffee, 100 things from distant lands that were unknown to us not long ago. I can show my grandson how houses are built, not of sun-dried mud, but of fired bricks and mortar. Now we are drilling a deep well. When it is finished, 6 taps will give us pure, cool water to drink. All the time we're learning new ideas, and our world is being transformed. Look, is not Omar Yusuf one of our own people already a field inspector? Have we not 2 schools where a few years ago we had none? Thus the knowledge of the whole world lies open to the sons of goat herds, to little Ahmed, my own grandson. What opportunities lie before these children? Opportunities which my generation just missed. Yet we help to create them with the new wealth from our cotton, its flowers, its ripening sea bulbs. Only 30 years or so ago, I drove my goats into the growing cotton. But now,
For their labor, the tenants receive 4/10 of the profits from the cotton they grow. A 2/10 share went to the company for financing and managing the scheme. The company was the brain of the scheme, controlling its millions of capital, the sale of the harvest, the welfare of 900 villages. It brought the science and finance of the West to a primitive people and did not enslave them, but made them partners. To the government of the Sudan, for building and maintaining Sana'a and the main canals, a 4/10 share. This revenue from this one scheme, from this one dam, provides more than 2/3 of the income of the whole of the Sudan. Nile control did not end at Sana'a. More weirs have been built in Egypt. Aswan's height and storage have been increased. There are plans for a new reservoir in the Sudan at Marawi. In 1936, Jebel Aulia was completed. Above Sana'a, a reservoir site has been surveyed at Rosaires, and plans finalized to bypass the wasteful Sud marshes. One day, Lake Albert will be dammed. And at the source of the White Nile at Owen Falls, the great hydroelectric scheme is about to transform the life of Central Africa. And by damming Uganda's Lake Victoria, it will form a reservoir the size of England, whose stored water will break the drought in the Sudan upon the Gezira plain that has enabled a nation to raise its head. In 1951, after a life of 25 years, the company's investment was repaid with interest, and the scheme became the property of the government and people of the Sudan.
Allah, Sidi ibn Sidi, aywa, Sidi ibn Sidi, aywa, Sidi Harm al-Ghayt, aywa, عاذرنا Sidi.